The communication beacon flickered its last desperate signal into the void of space. Zara Nix pressed her four-fingered hand against the cool metal surface of the transmission array, feeling the vibrations of the dying equipment beneath her palm. Her large, silver eyes reflected the red warning lights that bathed the command center in an ominous glow. "How long before the Korath fleet reaches our moon base?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question carried the weight of her entire species' survival. Commander Velcor, his blue-scaled skin glistening with nervous perspiration, checked his tactical display for the 100th time in the past hour. 18 standard hours, maybe less if they push their engines harder than expected. Zara Nix nodded slowly, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed to grow dimmer with each passing moment. The Zalthran Confederacy had been fighting the Korath Empire for 3 cycles now, ever since the metal-hungry invaders had swept through the Outer Rim systems like a plague of locusts. World after world had fallen to their massive war machines, and seemingly endless armies of bioengineered soldiers. The Zalthran people were scientists, engineers, and philosophers. They had built beautiful cities that floated among the clouds of their gas giant homeworld, created art that could make even the most hardened warrior weep, and unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light communication across vast distances. But they were not warriors. Their weapons were designed for defense, their ships built for exploration and research, not conquest. When the Korath came, the Confederacy had done what any civilized species would do. They had called for help. The galactic community was vast and varied. Hundreds of species belonged to different alliances, trade federations, and mutual defense pacts. Surely someone would answer their distress calls. Surely someone would care that an entire peaceful civilization was about to be wiped from existence. But the responses had been disappointing, then discouraging, and finally heartbreaking. The Yilvani Republic, masters of energy weapons and shields, had sent polite regrets. Their forces were committed elsewhere, they claimed, though intelligence suggested their fleets sat idle in their home systems. The Thraxian Empire, known for their massive battleships and skilled military tacticians, had offered to negotiate a surrender on behalf of the Zalthran people. For a reasonable fee, of course. Even worse were the species that simply ignored the calls entirely. The Necton Collective, the Crimson Stars Alliance, the Independent Worlds Union. All remained silent, as the Korath war machine ground closer to the Zalthran homeworld. "Any word from the hegemony?" Zara Nix asked, though she already knew the answer from Velcor's expression. "They've classified our situation as an internal matter between Rim species," he replied bitterly. "Apparently, we're too far from their core systems to warrant intervention." Zara Nix closed her eyes and let out a long breath. The hegemony was their last hope, the most powerful alliance in this sector of the galaxy. If they wouldn't help, then truly no one would. The command center's main view screen displayed the tactical situation with cold, clinical precision. Red dots representing Korath forces outnumbered the blue dots of Zalthran defenders by more than 20 to 1. The enemy fleet had already overwhelmed the outer defense stations and was systematically destroying evacuation ships trying to flee the system. "What about the others?" asked Lieutenant Nexvera from her position at the sensor station. She was young, barely past her naming ceremony, and still held on to hope that the older officers had long since abandoned. "The humans?" A uncomfortable silence settled over the command center. Several officers exchanged glances, and someone in the back made a sound that might have been laughter or crying. "Humans." The strange bipedal mammals from a small blue world on the far edge of the galaxy. They had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel, and had been exploring space for less than a century. Most species considered them little more than curious primitives, notable mainly for their unusual stubbornness and their tendency to pack bond with anything that moved. The galactic database entry on humans was brief and largely dismissive. They were classified as a developing species, with limited technological capabilities and primitive social structures. Their military was described as fragmented and inefficient, and their weapons technology was rated several generations behind galactic standards. Most troubling to civilized species was the human tendency toward violence. They had spent most of their recorded history fighting among themselves, developing increasingly creative ways to kill members of their own species. Only recently had they managed to unite their world under a single government, and even that unity seemed fragile to outside observers. The humans received our distress signal, Velcor admitted reluctantly. But their closest forces are in the Sol system, 47 light-years from here. Even if they left immediately, which they haven't, they couldn't arrive for weeks. And even if they did come, added Senior Technician Morzept, what could they do? Their largest warships are smaller than our science vessels. Their weapons use projectiles and chemical explosives. They don't even have proper energy shields. Nexvara's shoulders sagged with disappointment. She had heard stories about humans, strange tales from traders and diplomats who had encountered them in neutral space. They were said to be incredibly persistent, never giving up, even when victory seemed impossible. Some claimed that humans had an almost supernatural ability to survive situations that would destroy other species. But stories were one thing, and military reality was another. The tactical display updated, showing the Korath Vanguard entering the outer system. The enemy ships were massive, bristling with weapons and armor plating forged from the remains of conquered worlds. Each one could likely destroy a dozen Zalthran vessels without taking significant damage. All evacuation transports report ready for departure, announced Communications Officer Havnal. The civilians are aboard and waiting for escort to the rally point. Zara Nix straightened her shoulders and walked to the center of the command platform. Around her, dozens of officers and technicians worked frantically at their stations, trying to coordinate what might be the final evacuation of their homeworld. She had trained for this moment her entire career, but she had never imagined it would feel so hopeless. "Signal the fleet," she commanded. "All escort vessels are to accompany the evacuation convoy to the Cathara Nebula. We'll make our stand here and buy them as much time as possible." "Admiral," Velcor said quietly, "the defense fleet won't last more than an hour against that armada." "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her hearts. "But it's an hour our people need to escape." The Zalthran defense fleet was pitifully small compared to the approaching storm. 18 light cruisers, 34 frigates, and a handful of patrol vessels, barely enough to defend against pirates under normal circumstances. Their weapons were primarily designed for asteroid mining and orbital construction work, hastily retrofitted with military targeting systems that had never been tested in real combat. As the hours passed, the command center's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Status reports came in regularly, each one painting a grimmer picture than the last. The Korath fleet was moving faster than expected, their ships showing no signs of fatigue or mechanical strain. Intelligence suggested they were using some kind of new propulsion technology, probably stolen from one of their recent conquests. "Contact on long-range sensors," reported sensor specialist Kev Tarn. "The Korath main fleet will reach weapons range in 6 hours. Zara Nix nodded grimly. The evacuation convoy would need at least 8 hours to reach the nebula's edge, where they could disappear among the dense gas clouds and find temporary safety. Her fleet would have to buy 2 more hours than they could possibly survive. "Any response from our distress beacon?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Negative, Admiral. The beacon is still transmitting on all emergency frequencies, but..." Havnal's voice trailed off. What was there to say? Help was not coming. The galaxy had chosen to look the other way, while the Korath Empire consumed another peaceful species. The view screen shifted to show the evacuation convoy departing from the orbital stations around Zalthra Prime. Thousands of ships of all sizes formed a ragged procession, carrying the surviving members of a civilization that had taken millennia to build and would be destroyed in a matter of hours. Children who would never see their homeworld again, artists whose masterworks would be melted down for scrap metal, scientists whose research would be lost forever, all because the galactic community lacked the courage or compassion to intervene when it mattered most. "Admiral," Nexvara called out suddenly, excitement creeping into her voice. "I'm getting something strange on the outer perimeter sensors. It's faint, but there's definitely something there." Zara Nix moved to the sensor station, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Korath scouts?" "No, ma'am. The sensor signature is different. Smaller ships, but they're moving in formation, and their propulsion systems don't match anything in our database. The main view screen zoomed in on the edge of the solar system, where space seemed empty except for the distant stars. But the sensors were picking up something. Multiple contacts moving at incredible speed toward the inner system. How many ships? Velcor asked, joining them at the sensor station. Difficult to say, Kevtarn replied, his fingers dancing over the controls as he tried to refine the readings. The signatures keep shifting, like they're using some kind of stealth technology. I count at least 30 contacts, possibly more. Could be Korath reinforcements. Morzept suggested pessimistically. They might be using captured technology to mask their approach. But something about the sensor readings bothered Zara Nix. The formation was too disciplined, too precise. The Korath were brutal and effective, but their tactics relied on overwhelming force rather than subtlety. These ships moved like dancers, weaving through space in perfect coordination despite their incredible speed. How long until they reach us? She asked. At their current velocity, approximately 90 minutes, Zara Nix felt a chill run down her spine. Whatever was coming would arrive well before the Korath main fleet. But after the enemy vanguard had already engaged her forces, if these were hostile reinforcements, the battle would be over before it began. All stations, prepare for Admiral. Havnal's voice cut through the command center's noise like a plasma blade. I'm receiving a transmission from the unknown contacts. It's on the old human communication frequency. Every head in the command center turned toward the communications station. The old human frequency was something of a joke among galactic species. A primitive radio band that the humans used before they had been given access to proper quantum communications technology. Most ships didn't even monitor it anymore. Put it through, Zara Nix ordered, her voice barely steady. The speakers crackled with static, and then a voice emerged from the noise. It was distinctly human, speaking accented but understandable galactic standard, with an odd mixture of formality and casual confidence. Attention Zalthran Fleet, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force, commanding Task Force Retribution. We received your distress call and have come to assist. Please transmit tactical data on enemy positions and strength. We'll take it from here. The command center erupted in shocked murmurs and exclamations. Humans. The primitive, backwards humans had actually come. They had traveled 47 light-years to answer a call for help that every other civilized species had ignored. But even as hope began to bloom in Zara Nix's chest, reality crashed back down around her. 30 human ships, no matter how bravely they fought, could not stand against the Korath armada. The humans had just flown across half the galaxy to die alongside the Zalthran people. Open a channel, she commanded, her voice thick with emotion. Admiral Chen. This is Admiral Zara Nix of the Zalthran Defense Force. We are grateful for your response, but you must understand the situation. The Korath fleet numbers over 600 ships, including heavy battleships and assault carriers. Your forces should evacuate immediately. The reply came back almost instantly, tinged with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. Admiral Zara Nix, we appreciate the concern, but we didn't come this far just to turn around and go home. Besides, 600 ships isn't that many. We've faced worse odds than that before. Around the command center, Zalthran officers stared at each other in disbelief. Humans had faced worse odds than 600 to 30? That was either the bravest or most foolish statement any of them had ever heard. Admiral Chen, Zara Nix tried again, perhaps you don't fully understand. Each Korath battleship masses 50 times your largest vessel. Their weapons can pierce any known shielding system. This isn't a battle you can win. There was a pause, and when the human voice returned, it carried a new quality. Something cold and hard that made the fur on Zara Nix's arms stand on end. Admiral, with respect, you called for help. We came. Now please transmit those tactical coordinates so we can show these Korath bastards what happens when they pick on our friends. The word friends hit Zara Nix like a physical blow. In all the responses from galactic powers, none had used that word. Trade partners, potential allies, strategic interests, but never friends. The humans, whom most species barely acknowledged as sentient, had crossed interstellar space to help people they had never met, because it was the right thing to do. "Transmitting tactical data now," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Admiral Chen, thank you. Even if we don't survive this, thank you for coming." "Oh, we're going to survive this," came the reply. And this time, there was no mistaking the predatory grin in the human's voice. "All of us. The Korath are about to learn why Earth doesn't have many nice neighbors anymore." On the tactical display, the human ships had spread into a complex formation that seemed to make no tactical sense. They were too spread out to provide mutual support, too small to pose a serious threat, and positioned in a way that left them vulnerable to crossfire from multiple directions. But as Zaranix watched, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The human formation wasn't random at all. It was a carefully orchestrated trap, with each ship positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would channel the enemy into a killing zone. And the Korath vanguard, confident in their overwhelming superiority, was flying straight into it. "All Zulthran vessels." Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the comm system. "Recommend you pull back to minimum safe distance. This is about to get messy." The Korath ships emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of angry hornets, their hulls glowing with the heat of rapid deceleration. 12 heavy cruisers and twice as many escort vessels, bristling with weapons and armor plating that had been tested in a dozen successful campaigns. They saw the pathetic human fleet spread out before them and began to laugh over open channels. 30 tiny ships, barely larger than shuttlecraft, daring to challenge the might of the Korath Empire. It would be a massacre so complete that the recordings would be used for entertainment in Korath bars for years to come. The Korath commander opened a channel and began the ritual demands for surrender, his voice booming with arrogance and contempt. But before he could finish, Admiral Chen's voice cut him off. "Sorry, but we're not really the surrendering type. Task Force retribution. Weapons free. Show them what Earth sends to bullies." And then, in the space of 3 heartbeats, everything changed. The human ships moved like nothing Zaranix had ever seen before. Where Korath vessels were brutish and direct, and Zulthran craft were elegant but predictable, the human warships danced through space with a fluid grace that seemed to defy physics itself. "Impossible," whispered Kevtarn from his sensor station. "They're pulling 12G turns without inertial compensators. Their crews should be paced against the bulkheads." But the humans weren't just surviving those impossible maneuvers, they were thriving in them. The lead ship, a sleek vessel that the tactical computer helpfully identified as TDF Retribution, rolled inverted and dove beneath the Korath formation like a predator striking from below. The Korath commander, still broadcasting his surrender demands, suddenly found his words cut short as streams of what looked like simple projectiles began hammering into his flagship's shields. The weapons were primitive by galactic standards. Chunks of metal accelerated to incredible velocities. But there were so many of them, coming from so many angles, that the Korath shields began to flicker and fail within seconds. "What in the void are those weapons?" Velcor asked, staring at the tactical display in disbelief. "Kinetic projectiles," replied Morzept, his voice filled with academic fascination despite the desperate situation. "But they're firing them at 30% light speed. The energy release on impact is..." His calculations were interrupted by the spectacular explosion of a Korath escort vessel. The human projectiles had punched through its shields, armor, and hull as if they were made of paper, triggering a cascade failure in the ship's power systems. "How are they generating that much velocity?" Zaranix asked, but her question was lost in the chaos of battle reports flooding the command center. The human ships weren't just fast and well-armed, they were impossibly coordinated. They moved as if controlled by a single mind, each vessel anticipating the movements of its companions with supernatural precision. When one ship dove to avoid incoming fire, another was already in position to cover its retreat. When a group of Korath vessels tried to concentrate their fire on a single target, they found themselves shooting at empty space as their quarry had already moved to safety. "Admiral Chen," Zaranix called over the comm system, "how are your ships communicating so quickly? Quantum entanglement networks have at least a 3-second delay over these distances." The reply came back, tinged with what sounded like pride. Trade secret, Admiral. Let's just say humans have gotten very good at thinking as a group when we need to. On the tactical display, the Korath formation was beginning to break apart. 3 of their escort vessels were already destroyed, and 2 more were venting atmosphere from hull breaches. But more concerning was the way their remaining ships were moving, erratically, almost panicked, as if their crews couldn't understand what was happening to them. Korath vessels are transmitting on emergency frequencies, reported Havnal. They're requesting immediate reinforcements and... Admiral, they're calling for authorization to retreat. Retreat. The word hung in the air like an impossible dream. The Korath Empire had never retreated from anything. They were conquerors, destroyers, the unstoppable force that had rolled over 24 systems without suffering a single strategic defeat. And yet, here they were, being systematically dismantled by 30 primitive human ships. The battle continued with devastating efficiency. Human vessels would appear from seemingly empty space, deliver precisely targeted strikes, and vanish again before the enemy could respond. Their weapons weren't just powerful. They were surgically precise, targeting specific systems and components with an accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of Korath ship design. How do they know where to hit? Nexvara asked wonderingly. Those shots are targeting critical systems that aren't even marked on standard schematics. Humans are remarkably good at learning their enemies' weaknesses, came Admiral Chen's voice over the open channel. We've been studying Korath ships for 3 months now. Ever since we heard about their expansion into this sector. Fascinating engineering, really. Powerful, but with some rather obvious design flaws once you know what to look for. 3 months. The humans had been preparing for this battle for 3 months, studying their enemy, planning their approach, readying themselves to travel halfway across the galaxy to help people they had never met, while the great powers of the galactic community had debated and delayed and ultimately chosen to do nothing. Earth's warriors had quietly prepared for war. The Korath flagship, a massive dreadnought bristling with enough firepower to level a city, tried to bring its main batteries to bear on the TDF Retribution. The human ship should have been vaporized instantly. Its shields were a joke compared to Korath energy weapons, and its armor was barely thicker than a civilian transport's hull. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Missile launch from the human flagship, reported Kev Tarn, his voice rising with excitement. Multiple contacts. Admiral, they've launched over 200 projectiles, but these weren't the kinetic rounds the humans had been using. These were something else entirely. Small, fast objects that moved with their own propulsion systems. Weaving through space like living creatures, they split apart as they flew, each one becoming dozens of smaller contacts that swarmed around the Korath defensive fire like angry insects. What are those? Velcor asked. Smart weapons, Admiral Chen replied, her voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Each one has its own targeting system and enough processing power to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. We call them Hornets. The Korath are about to find out why. The swarm of human missiles reached the Korath flagship and began their work with methodical precision. They didn't all strike at once. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they attacked in carefully coordinated waves, each group targeting a different system or component. The first wave disabled the Dreadnought's point defense systems. The second wave took out its main communications array. The third wave punched through the weakened shields and began systematically destroying weapon systems, starting with the most dangerous and working their way down. They're not trying to destroy the ship, Zara Nix realized with growing amazement. They're disabling it, piece by piece. Waste not, want not, came Admiral Chen's reply. That's a lot of good metal and technology. Shame to blow it all up when we can just take it apart instead. Within minutes, the mighty Korath flagship was reduced to a helpless hulk, its weapons silenced, its engines dead, its crew trapped inside a vessel that had become their prison, and the humans had done it without even scratching the ship's main hull structure. The remaining Korath vessels, seeing their flagship's fate, began broadcasting surrender signals on all frequencies. But Admiral Chen's response was swift and uncompromising. Negative on the surrender. You've got exactly 10 minutes to turn around and jump out of this system. After that, we're going to treat you as hostile targets and respond accordingly." "Admiral Chen," Zara Nix interjected, "according to galactic warfare conventions, you're required to accept surrender when it's offered in good faith." There was a long pause before the human replied, and when she did, her voice carried a cold fury that made every Zalthran in the command center shiver. "Admiral, these bastards have been murdering civilians and enslaving entire populations for the past 3 years. They've destroyed 17 different species and turned their worlds into strip mines. As far as I'm concerned, they've forfeited any right to galactic protections." She paused, and when she continued, her tone had shifted to something more professional but no less dangerous. "Besides, we're not part of your galactic community. We never signed your conventions or agreed to your rules. We're here as friends of the Zalthran people, and we'll handle this situation according to human law." The implications of that statement sent ripples of shock through the command center. Humans operating outside galactic law, ignoring established protocols, answerable to no authority but their own conscience. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Zara Nix found it oddly comforting. The surviving Korath vessels began their retreat, jumping to hyperspace with desperate haste. In less than 30 minutes, the vanguard force that should have been the first wave of Zalthran extinction had been completely routed by a force 1/10 their size. "Damage report." Admiral Chen's voice came over the comm system. And it took Zara Nix a moment to realize the human was asking about her own forces, not the enemy. "All Zalthran vessels report minimal damage," she replied, still struggling to process what she had just witnessed. "Admiral, that was extraordinary. How did you achieve such overwhelming tactical superiority?" "Practice," came the laconic reply. "And motivation." "Admiral, we need to discuss the main Korath fleet. Our sensors indicate they'll arrive in approximately 4 hours. We need to coordinate our defense." Defense. The word seemed almost quaint now. 4 hours ago, Zara Nix had been planning a desperate delaying action that might buy her people a few extra hours of life. Now, with 30 human ships at her side, she was actually considering the possibility of victory. "Admiral Chen, the main fleet consists of over 600 vessels, including 37 heavy battleships and 12 assault carriers. Even after what we've just witnessed, those are still impossible odds." "Admiral," came the reply, and this time there was genuine warmth in the human voice. "You're thinking like someone who fights fair. Humans gave up fighting fair about the same time we figured out how to throw rocks at our enemies. We've had several thousand years to refine our approach since then." The tactical display shifted to show the outer system, where the massive Korath armada was beginning its final approach to Zalthra Prime. From this distance, they looked like a dark cloud of destruction, blotting out the stars themselves. "What do you need from us?" Zara Nix asked, surprised by her own willingness to follow the lead of these strange aliens who had appeared from nowhere to save her people. "Information. Mostly. We need detailed scans of their fleet composition, formation patterns, and approach vectors. We also need you to coordinate with your evacuation convoy. We're going to need them to do something that might seem a bit counterintuitive. What do you have in mind?" There was a pause. And when Admiral Chen spoke again, her voice carried a note of anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying. "We're going to give the Korath exactly what they want, a target they can't resist, positioned exactly where we need them to be. And then we're going to show them why humans are the only species in the galaxy that actually enjoys being outnumbered." Over the next 2 hours, the human ships implemented a plan so audacious that Zara Nix would never have believed it possible if she wasn't watching it unfold before her eyes. Using the Zalthran fleet as coordinators and the evacuation convoy as bait, they began arranging the pieces of an elaborate trap that spanned the entire inner system. The human vessels seemed to multiply before her sensors, appearing and disappearing in seemingly random locations around Zalthra Prime and its moons. Some of the contacts were clearly real ships, but others seemed to be some kind of decoys or sensor ghosts that confused her instruments. "How many ships do you actually have?" she asked Admiral Chen during one of their coordination calls. 30, came the reply. But the Korath don't know that. By the time they figure it out, it'll be too late. The evacuation convoy, following human instructions, had taken up position near the fourth moon of Zalthra Prime. To any observer, they looked like sitting ducks. Thousands of helpless civilian vessels clustered together with minimal escort, perfect targets for the approaching armada. "Admiral, are you certain this will work?" Zara Nix asked, as the Korath fleet began its final approach. "If your plan fails, those are our people out there." "It'll work," Admiral Chen replied with absolute confidence. "Admiral, how much do you know about human military history?" "Very little, I'm afraid. We've been fighting wars for our entire recorded history, not just between nations or species, but between tribes, city-states, religious groups, political factions, sometimes even individual families. We've fought wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion, and sometimes just because we were bored." The human's voice took on a contemplative quality as she continued. "Most species see that as a weakness. They look at our history and see chaos, barbarism, primitive aggression that we should have evolved beyond by now. But they're missing the point, which is, we're still here, after 10,000 years of trying to wipe ourselves out, after wars that should have destroyed our entire civilization, after conflicts that killed hundreds of millions of our own people. We're still here, and we've gotten very, very good at winning wars." The Korath main fleet was now visible on long-range sensors, a dark mass of destruction that seemed to dwarf everything else in the system. But as Zara Nix watched, she began to notice something odd about their formation. The enemy fleet was concentrating its firepower exactly where the humans wanted it, focused on the evacuation convoy and the apparent human defensive positions. They were positioning themselves perfectly for the trap that Admiral Chen had spent the last 2 hours setting up. "All Zalthran vessels," Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the comm system, "recommend you move to minimum safe distance. In about 10 minutes, this entire system is going to become a very unfriendly place for anyone who isn't human." Zara Nix gave the orders for her fleet to withdraw, but she kept her command ship's sensors focused on the approaching battle. She had to see this, had to witness whatever miracle the humans were about to perform. The Korath fleet entered weapons range and began their attack with overwhelming force. Energy beams that could melt mountains, missile swarms that could level cities, and kinetic projectiles the size of buildings all converged on the positions where they believed the human defenders were hiding. For a moment, it seemed like the trap had failed. The human ships appeared to be taking devastating damage, several contacts winking out on the tactical display as they were apparently destroyed. But then Admiral Chen's voice came over the comm system, calm and controlled despite the chaos erupting around her. "Phase 1 complete. All units, initiate Phase 2. Time to show these bastards what Earth's children can really do." And the real battle began. The space around Zalthra Prime exploded into light and fury as the Korath Armada unleashed its full firepower on what they believed were human defensive positions. Energy beams capable of cracking moons stabbed through the void, while missiles the size of frigates streaked toward their targets with single-minded determination. But something was wrong with the human response. "Admiral," Kevtarn reported from his sensor station, confusion evident in his voice. "The human ships aren't returning fire. They're just sitting there." Zara Nix watched the tactical display with growing concern as human contact after human contact winked out under the devastating Korath barrage. In less than 5 minutes, half of Admiral Chen's task force had apparently been destroyed without firing a single shot in return. "Retribution. This is Admiral Zara Nix," she called over the comm system. "Do you require assistance? Your forces appear to be taking heavy casualties." Admiral Chen's reply came back steady and untroubled. "All according to plan, Admiral. Phase 2 in progress. Stand by for fireworks." Even as she spoke, the Korath fleet was spreading out across the inner system, their commanders confident that they had broken the back of human resistance in the opening minutes of the battle. The massive dreadnoughts began moving toward the evacuation convoy, weapons charging for what would surely be a massacre of unprecedented proportions. And then reality shifted around them. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from the Korath fleet's own sensors. Ships that had been destroyed minutes earlier were suddenly back on the tactical display, whole and undamaged. Weapon signatures that didn't match anything in their databases began lighting up all around them, and the 30 human ships they had been tracking somehow became 300. Holographic projectors, Admiral Chen explained conversationally over the open channel, as if discussing the weather rather than the complete tactical destruction of an enemy fleet. We've been seeding them throughout the system for the past 2 hours. Amazing what you can do with a few mirrors, some creative programming, and enemies who are too arrogant to double-check their sensor readings. The Korath fleet found themselves surrounded by targets that shouldn't exist, taking fire from weapons that had supposedly been destroyed, fighting an enemy that seemed to multiply even as they watched. But the real nightmare was just beginning. All units, Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos. Initiate Protocol Omega. Time to show them what happens when you threaten Earth's friends. Space itself seemed to tear open, as massive shapes emerged from hyperspace inside the Korath formation. Not ships. These were something else entirely. Enormous structures the size of small moons, bristling with weapons that defied every law of physics that the Korath thought they understood. Impossible, breathed Morzept from his analysis station. Those objects mass more than most space stations. You can't drop something that large out of hyperspace with that level of precision. The gravitational stress alone would tear them apart. But the impossible structures were not only intact, they were moving with the fluid grace of living creatures, rotating and shifting to bring their weapons to bear on the suddenly trapped Korath fleet. Each one was different, as if built by artists rather than engineers, yet they moved in perfect coordination. Admiral Chen, Zara Nix called out, her voice tight with amazement. What are those things? Mobile battle platforms, came the reply. We call them Wrath of Terra class. We've got 12 of them, each one carrying enough firepower to sterilize a continent. The Korath wanted to see what human military engineering looks like when we're actually trying. Well, here it is. The platforms opened fire. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration of technological superiority so absolute that it bordered on the supernatural. The human weapons didn't just destroy their targets. They disintegrated them at the molecular level, turning massive Korath battleships into clouds of constituent atoms in seconds. But even more terrifying than the weapons themselves was the precision with which they were deployed. The platforms didn't fire randomly or waste shots on unimportant targets. Instead, they moved through the Korath fleet with surgical precision, systematically dismantling the enemy's command structure, communications network, and strategic capabilities. They're targeting specific individuals, Nexvara observed with horrified fascination. Those shots are precise enough to eliminate particular crew members while leaving the rest of the ship intact. Korath command hierarchy is remarkably predictable, Admiral Chen explained. Take out the right 15 or 20 officers, and their entire military doctrine collapses. We've been studying their organizational patterns for months. The Korath fleet tried to fight back, but their efforts were futile. Their weapons, designed to overwhelm enemy shields through brute force, simply couldn't penetrate the exotic defensive fields, protecting the human platforms. Energy beams that could melt asteroid mining stations were absorbed harmlessly. Missiles that could crack open battleship hulls detonated uselessly against barriers that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. And through it all, the 30 original human ships danced between the massive platforms like deadly escorts, picking off any Korath vessel that tried to break free from the killing zone. Their movements were impossible to predict or counter. They seemed to know what their enemies were going to do before the enemies knew it themselves. How? Velcor asked, staring at the tactical display in disbelief. How are they coordinating so perfectly? Even quantum entanglement networks couldn't provide that level of real-time communication. Admiral Zara Nix. Admiral Chen's voice carried a note of something that might have been pride. Would you like to meet the rest of my crew? Before Zara Nix could ask what she meant, new voices began speaking over the comm system. Dozens of them, each with its own distinct personality and tone, yet all unmistakably human. Admiral, this is Captain James Rodriguez of the TDF Vengeance. It's an honor to fight alongside the Zalthrin people. Captain Sarah Kim here, commanding the TDF Righteous Anger. These Korath scumbags picked the wrong species to mess with. Captain Michael O'Brien, TDF Unstoppable Force. Ma'am, your people's distress call reached us just as we were finishing our patrol route. Couldn't very well ignore neighbors in need. The voices kept coming, captain after captain checking in from across the battle space. But the numbers didn't add up. There were hundreds of voices, reporting from ships that the sensors showed were spread across multiple star systems. Admiral Chen, Zara Nix said slowly. How many ships do you actually have in this engagement? There was a pause, and when Admiral Chen replied, her voice carried a note of quiet satisfaction. That's complicated. The 30 ships you can see? They're just the physical components. The real task force retribution includes every human military vessel within 50 light-years of here. We're all connected through quantum consciousness linkage. Every captain, every crew member, every tactical system, all thinking and acting as one unified force. The implications hit Zaranix like a physical blow. The humans weren't just coordinating their forces through advanced communication technology. They were literally sharing their minds across interstellar distances, creating a collective intelligence that could process tactical information and make decisions faster than any individual crew. How is that possible? She whispered. Humans are social creatures, Admiral. We've always been at our best when we're working together. About 50 years ago, our scientists figured out how to extend that cooperation across space and time. When one of us is threatened, all of us respond. When one of us learns something new, we all benefit from that knowledge. The battle, if it could still be called that, was winding down with devastating efficiency. The Korath fleet that had entered the system with such confidence was now reduced to scattered debris and a handful of damaged vessels desperately trying to escape. But the humans weren't letting anyone go. Korath vessels. Admiral Chen's voice boomed across all frequencies. You have one opportunity to survive this encounter. Drop your shields, power down your weapons, and prepare to be boarded. You will be taken to a secure facility where you will be held until arrangements can be made for war crimes tribunals. Admiral, Zaranix interjected, I thought you said humans weren't bound by galactic conventions. We're not, Admiral Chen replied. But we have our own sense of justice. These individuals will be tried according to human law for their crimes against sentient beings. The penalty for genocide is, well, let's just say they'll have plenty of time to think about what they've done. The surviving Korath vessels, seeing no alternative except total annihilation, began surrendering one by one. The massive human battle platforms deployed smaller ships that swarmed over the enemy vessels, securing them with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. How many times have you done this? Zaranix asked. The Korath expansion stopped being our problem about 6 months ago, Admiral Chen replied matter-of-factly. This is just the cleanup operation. We've been working our way through their conquered territories, liberating systems and gathering intelligence. The attack on your people was just the excuse we needed to finish the job. 6 months. The humans had been fighting the Korath Empire for 6 months, systematically dismantling their military forces and liberating their conquered worlds. And somehow, the galactic community had never even heard about it. Why didn't you tell anyone? Zaranix asked. Why didn't you announce that you were taking action against them? There was a long pause before Admiral Chen answered, and when she did, her voice carried a note of something that might have been disappointment. Because every time we've tried to work within galactic political structures, we've been told to wait, to be patient, to follow proper channels and respect established procedures. Meanwhile, people were dying. Civilizations were being destroyed. Entire species were being enslaved or exterminated. She paused, and when she continued, her tone was gentler, but no less determined. We gave the galaxy a chance to handle this problem through diplomacy and collective action. When that failed, we handled it ourselves. The Korath Empire ended 6 months ago. They just didn't know it yet. I'm done prodding. 2-4. The tactical display now showed a very different picture than it had just an hour earlier. Where once there had been a massive enemy armada, There were now only the geometric patterns of human ships maintaining perfect formation around captured Korath vessels. The battle platforms had already begun to fade from sensors as they prepared to return to whatever dimensional space they normally occupied. "Admiral Chen," Zara Nix said, her voice thick with emotion, "on behalf of the Zalthran people, I want to thank you. You've given us our lives, our freedom, our future. How can we ever repay this debt?" "Admiral," came the reply. And this time Admiral Chen's voice was warm with genuine affection. "You don't owe us anything. This is what neighbors do for each other. This is what friends do." That word again, friends. In the cold calculations of galactic politics, friendship was a luxury that most species couldn't afford. But humans, it seemed, made their strategic decisions based on entirely different criteria. "What happens now?" Zara Nix asked. "Now, you rebuild. We'll help with that, of course. Human engineering teams are already en route to assist with reconstruction efforts. We'll also be establishing a permanent defense station in this system. Consider it insurance against anyone else who might want to cause trouble." The comm channel crackled as Admiral Chen switched to a broader frequency that reached every ship in the system. "All vessels. This is Admiral Chen. The Korath threat to this system has been eliminated. Zalthran evacuation convoy. You are clear to return to your homeworld. Task Force Retribution will remain in system for the next 72 hours to ensure system security and assist with damage assessment." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. To any other potential aggressors who might be monitoring this channel, the Zalthran people are now under the protection of the Terran Defense Force. Any hostile action against them will be considered an act of war against humanity. And trust me, you don't want to find out what happens when humans actually get angry. Over the next 3 days, Zara Nix watched in amazement as human ships began arriving from across the galaxy. Not warships this time, but engineering vessels, hospital ships, cargo transports filled with relief supplies, and even what appeared to be civilian volunteers coming to help with the reconstruction effort. "How many humans are there?" she asked Admiral Chen during one of their daily coordination meetings. "About 15 billion on Earth. Maybe another 5 billion spread across our colony worlds and space stations. Not very many compared to some galactic civilizations, but we're growing. And they're all willing to help us?" Admiral Chen smiled, an expression that Zara Nix was learning to read despite the alien facial structure. "Admiral, when word got out that we'd found a new species that needed help, we had to turn away volunteers. Humans have this weird compulsion to help anyone we consider family. And as far as we're concerned, anyone willing to stand up to bullies automatically qualifies for family status." The reconstruction effort proceeded with typical human efficiency. Systems that should have taken years to repair were fixed in weeks. Infrastructure that had been destroyed in the Korath attacks was rebuilt with improvements that made it stronger and more resilient than before. But more than the physical reconstruction, it was the human attitude that amazed Zara Nix. They didn't act like conquerors or saviors. They acted like neighbors who had happened to be in the area when trouble started. "Admiral," she said to Admiral Chen as the human task force prepared to depart, "I need to ask you something. Why do you do this? Your people could easily establish an empire that would span the galaxy. Your technology is centuries ahead of anyone else's. Your military capabilities are beyond anything we imagined possible. Why do you choose to help instead of conquer?" Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the stars through the command center's main viewport. "You know what the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is, Admiral?" she finally asked. "The Korath Empire? A human with nothing left to lose. When we're backed into a corner, when our friends are threatened, when everything we care about is in danger, that's when we become truly terrifying. Every species we've encountered seems to forget that we spent most of our history fighting against impossible odds and winning anyway." She turned to face Zara Nix directly. "But the flip side of that is equally true. When we have something worth protecting, when we're surrounded by friends and family, when we're part of a community that values what we value, that's when we become our best selves. That's when we build instead of destroying. When we heal instead of hurting." She gestured toward the human ships that filled the space around Zalthra Prime. Every one of those ships is crewed by people who chose to come here. Not because they were ordered to, not because they hoped to gain something, but because they heard that good people were in trouble and decided that was their problem too. Admiral Chen extended her hand in the human gesture of friendship that Zara Nix had learned to recognize. The galaxy is full of species that want to rule others. Humans just want to belong to something worth defending. And as far as we're concerned, any civilization that calls for help when innocents are in danger is exactly the kind of community we want to be part of. 3 months later, Zara Nix stood in the newly constructed council chamber on Zalthra Prime, watching representatives from dozens of species arrive for what historians would later call the founding of the Galactic Alliance of Free Worlds. The humans had kept their word. Not only had they established permanent defense stations in liberated systems, but they had also helped coordinate the formation of a new interstellar organization based on mutual defense and voluntary cooperation, rather than political dominance or economic exploitation. Admiral Zara Nix, came a familiar voice from behind her. She turned to see Admiral Chen approaching, wearing the dress uniform of what was now being called the Alliance Defense Force. Sarah, Zara Nix said, using the human's given name as she had been invited to do. I see the hegemony has finally decided to join our little organization. Took them long enough, Sarah replied with characteristic human directness. Amazing how quickly political attitudes can change when the alternative is being left out of the most powerful military alliance in galactic history. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as species that had never spoken to each other before began the difficult work of building something better than what had come before. Any regrets? Zara Nix asked. About what? About changing the galaxy forever. About forcing the established powers to acknowledge that there's a better way to do things. Sarah Chen smiled, that peculiarly human expression that had become a symbol of hope across dozens of worlds. Admiral, humanity spent 10,000 years learning that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak, that the fortunate have an obligation to help the less fortunate, and that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. She looked out at the assembled delegates, representatives of species that had learned the hard way that the galaxy could be a cruel and unforgiving place. The only regret I have is that it took us so long to get here. But we're here now, and we're not going anywhere. The galaxy is about to learn what happens when humans find something worth fighting for. Outside the Great Chamber, human ships patrolled the space lanes, keeping watch over the growing alliance of free worlds. They bore names like Hope, Determination, Second Chance, and Never Forgotten. Names that spoke of a species that had never learned when to give up. And in the deep void between the stars, word was spreading. Across the galaxy, other species whispered the story of the day when 30 human ships had appeared out of nowhere to save a people they had never met. Simply because it was the right thing to do, the galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly what humanity had been hoping for.